Okay, good morning. Thank you for joining us this morning. I am Nader Pora, the co-director of the RCMAR National Coordinating Center here at UCLA. Welcome to today's webinar on the new NIH Data Management Sharing, or DMS, policy. We are fortunate to have two presenters from NIA today, Dr. James McNally and Rebecca Krupenevich, to talk to us about the DMS policy. We hope that this presentation will provide insights into compliance with this policy, particularly for specific situations, such as qualitative data, community-based participatory research, and third-party administrative data as examples. We specifically hope to gain insights related to the needs of the RCMAR community. Today's guests are Dr. James McNally, who is the director of the NACDA Program on Aging, a data archive containing over 1,600 studies related to health and the aging life course located at the University of Michigan. He works primarily on issues of family support and health among the aged, both in the United States and internationally. He does methodological research on the repair of deficient data and has been cited as an expert authority on imputation in deliberations before the US Supreme Court. Most recently, he has been working with NIA to support the implementation of the new NIH Data Management and Sharing guidelines. Dr. Rebecca Krupenevich is an AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow in NIA's Division of Behavioral and Social Research. She's working with BSR's Office of Data Resources and Analytics to support initiatives related to data sharing. Please make sure you keep yourself on mute during the presentation. We hope to have about 20 minutes at the end for a discussion. Please raise your virtual hand with questions and I will call on you. Let's start today's discussion. Dr. McNally.
Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for arranging this session and we look forward to your questions. We've already gotten a number of good questions. We're going to be talking about the rules and guidelines for developing a data management and sharing plan. And this is within the context of the Behavioral and Social Research branch of NIA. As an additional qualification, I'm also have been a researcher assisting the RCMAR programs for about 10 or 15 years, the McMAR at Michigan, Wayne State, and Michigan State. So we're very much aware of a lot of the concerns and how to address these issues. If you have questions and we don't get to you, or you have questions as you move forward with your research, I'm available at any time, either through my NIA address, which is at the bottom of the page, or you can contact me at my Michigan address. Just put data sharing, something like that, in the header, and I will get back to you. Next slide. Okay, let's start with just a basic definition. This is how the National Institutes of Health looks at data. Factual material, blah, blah, blah. The key issue for your data management sharing plan is that there's an expectation that you will share data that you collect as a researcher, whether you have published this information or not. We do not have an expectation that you can withhold data until you have time to write on it. The goal is to begin to share data to fulfill the fair and equitable distribution of data across the research community. So if you publish it, that needs to be shared. If you haven't published it, that also needs to be shared. So other researchers can hopefully use your data productively. Next slide. Okay, what absolutely has to be shared? You need to share enough data to validate and replicate your findings. We all know there's a validation and replication crisis in the social sciences, the inability to reproduce other people's research findings. We want to address that. So sharing the data you used, and also we argue strongly share the code that you used to produce those findings for replication. In addition, data resulting from an NIH-funded study that has not been used to support a publication. So basically, if you collect information using NIH funding, we have an expectation that that data will be shared with the research community. Null findings that do not result in a publication. We all know that negative findings are as interesting as positive findings. So don't be shy. Share your data. People can use it. It'll be wonderful. You'll feel better. Next slide. Okay, things you don't have to share. Your lab notes, any preliminary analysis, any case reports, your paper drafts, don't have to share those. And if you collect icky stuff, don't send it to us. We don't want it. There are biorepositories that are much more suited to dealing with biospecimens. So that is not part of the requirement for the data sharing plan. Next slide. And also, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat and we'll try to answer them as we go along. Rebecca will take this part and I'll try to answer questions during her section. So any questions that arise on the fly, just send it to us. There are acceptable reasons not to share. This is not a mandate to take control of your data or take it away from you. Consent limitations. This is a problem. And it's something that will be given more scrutiny by NIH as a whole. Your informed consent limitations have to be reasonable. You can't use the consent form to restrict data sharing anymore. So broad consent is preferred, but if you do have a study or if it's part of an existing study that has consent limitations, this is a legitimate reason not to share your data. If you have concerns about the privacy or safety of your participants, or there's a high risk of re-identification, then this also can become a defensible reason not to share your data, though you do have options, virtual enclaves, even a physical enclave. There's always a way, but this is something to consider when you're creating your data sharing and management plan. Another issue is federal, state, local, tribal laws or regulations. If you're working with a group that has sovereignty and they do not want to share their data, well, this has to be factored in, and this is a perfectly legitimate reason. International and legal restrictions on data sharing. This is another issue that we're trying to work on and will be working on over the coming years, but different countries have different legal perspectives on data sharing. The European Union, for example, has increasingly introduced restrictive regulations on data sharing. So be aware of local and also international laws if you're working internationally. Some countries are very open, some countries are very controlled. And data that cannot practically be digitalized. This also refers to some extent to qualitative data. It's one of the most difficult kinds of data to share. And to be perfectly honest, I have never seen a good data sharing plan for qualitative data. It really needs to be handled on a one-on-one case where access to interviews, qualitative, it's highly identifiable. It's got a number of issues. It generally cannot just be shared widely. So these are legitimate reasons to not broadly share your data. Next slide. Okay, these are some questions that have come up in preparation for the presentation. question number one is, how does this affect the RCMARs and your pilot projects? Working with McMar, we fund a number of pilot projects every year with junior scholars and young faculty. And how does this work? Well, right now you're grandfathered into the old system. All the RCMARs that are currently funded are exempt from the new DMS policies. You can use your existing data sharing plan that you did with your P30 application. Next round, you will have to do a data management sharing policy that's compliant with the new guidelines, and that will include the pilot studies. So everyone will have to explain how they're going to share the data that emerges from pilot studies. Next slide. We get a lot of questions about secondary data. If you're collecting data yourself, primary data, then it's your responsibility to share it along the data management and sharing guidelines. Secondary data, we do not encourage nor do we suggest that people should reshare secondary data. Typically, if you download secondary data from an established repository or archive, there will be a request that you do not redistribute because the data is publicly available. Anyone can come and get the data. So if you're using secondary data in either a pilot study, or if you're writing a new grant, R03, R21, R01, whatever, if you're using secondary data, then you don't have to reshare that. We do encourage you to reshare the code that you use to generate your analysis, and also any metadata or restructuring of data that you might do. But the data itself should remain available through the repository of record. Next slide. Okay, where do I archive my data? NACDA is one place. We have been funded by the National Institute on Aging for about 50 years now to be a resource for researchers who are collecting and want to share their data with the research community. We have two levels of curation at this point. We have the NACDA repository, which is fully curated. This takes time, and this process is generally restricted to high priority NIH studies like MIDAS or NCHAP, what have you not. We do take high impact studies to be fully curated. The other service we offer is open source. It's called NACDA OAR, and you can deposit your data set within the OAR pretty much instantaneously. So if you have a small study or you want to comply with the new guidelines, this is where one of the tricky elements emerges. If you put your data into a curation archive, such as the NACDA Aging Archive, it takes months for the data to go from deposit to release. According to the guidelines, you're supposed to have your data available by either the time of your first publication or the end of the funding period. So that makes it a little tricky. You'll have to coordinate with the repository early on to meet those deadlines. With the open source, NACDA OAR, Dataverse, what have you, you can pretty much deposit your data instantaneously, get your DOI, and be compliant with the NIA guidelines. Discoverability can be an issue for some of the open source repositories, but we could discuss that as a side issue at another time. There's also a number of NIA-supported repositories. There's generalist repositories, again, Dataverse, GitHub, Figleaf, things like that. So there's a number of resources out there. Also, a lot of publications will allow you to archive your research data as part of a publication, as long as it's small. I think it's Generally, there's a 2 or 3 gigabyte limitation on the data you deposit. All of these things will help you comply with the guidelines. We want to help you be consistent with these new guidelines and fulfill your obligations to the grant as provided to you. Not all of the solutions will guarantee a good return on your deposit. Others will, but the main thing is to meet the guidelines. Next slide. Okay, institutional repositories are another option. Most major universities and research institutes have their own internal repositories where they store research data, population centers, some of the RCMARs. This is perfectly acceptable as long as the data is discoverable and accessible. So you have to be able to find it somehow, and you have to be able to download it. So if your university or research institute has a data repository of their own, that is also perfectly acceptable. Next slide. What we look for in data repositories covers quite a wide range of attributes. The key ones when you're thinking about depositing your data, because again, one of the reasons you want to deposit your data is because it works well when you go for your next grant. If you can show that other people have been publishing using your data, this goes a long way towards convincing study section and your program officer that a new application has research value. So the more people who use your research for publications and original research goes to your benefit. We also want to make sure that you get attributed. NACTA, for example, requires all people who download a data set to attribute the original investigators who created the data as part of their bibliography. Key things to look for, though, when you're looking for a repository. Does it offer a persistent identifier, a DOI or something similar? Something that is unique to your study and is searchable. DOIs are nice because they get into Google Scholar. They're searchable on most search engines. Do they have good metadata? This is data about data. Does it describe the variables? Does it describe the methodology? Does it describe how the study was created? Without this kind of information, data is fairly useless. So good metadata is always a benefit in a deposit. Does it have a common format? Does it use a commonly used software package like SAS or R or Stata? And provenance. Can you show does the repository offer you a way to show ownership? Again, repositories do not own your data. You own your data. This is the result of your research, your hard work. What repositories do is provide a way to distribute your data and maintain a record of its use while you continue your research and the activities that lead to more grants, more publications. So the provenance is important. Does the repository acknowledge you as the creator of the data? And discoverability. Is it easy to find your data in a search engine or on a repository list? These are all what we consider very favorable characteristics of a data repository as you choose one. Next slide. And then there's human data. This is a special case. If your data is considered human subject research by your IRB or by HHS definition, then there are very specific sharing rules that you have to engage in. You have to make sure that wherever you deposit the data, say, for example, electronic health records, are they going to be compliant with the consent document that you created and your respondent signed? Do they have a good restricted use policy? Are they protecting your respondents? Do they offer privacy? Do they have plans in case something happens that people get a hold of the data inadvertently? Do they have download control? And do they have a way of punishing violators? ICPSR at the University of Michigan will routinely, fortunately not an often occurs, but if someone violates the use rules for restricted data, then the entire university is put on probation until they can resolve the problem and improve their training of researchers using data. Biorepositories is another special case. Their data has supply and demand issues. There's only so many cancer lines available. There's only so many tumors available. So they're dealt with in a biorepository environment. So this would be a very separate thing than the data sharing plans we're talking about today. ISBER is the organization that generally is the best resource for biospecimen management. Next slide. And how do you share data from human participants? You de-identify it to the greatest extent possible, as long as it doesn't undermine its scientific value. There's a common rule, and there are HIPAA privacy rule standards. Talk to university counsel, understand the legal issues and limitations on disclosure of data that has been classified as human subjects. But it's also to remember that just because you collected data from humans, it does not necessarily mean it is human subjects data when you're sharing it through a data management and sharing application. Next slide. HHS has a number of very useful click-through menus that help you establish whether or not you're working with human subject data based on Health and Human Services interpretations of the law. The key issue is when the original data is collected, it may be assigned as human subjects research, but common rule 45 CFR 46 no longer applies when the data is de-identified. So if you de-identify your data, then it is no longer considered to be human subjects according to HHS rules. Different local IRBs will have different interpretations of this idea, but this is the way that Health and Human Services lays out the process. So if it's de-identified data, then it's non-human subjects, and it can be shared fairly freely, either public use or under a restricted use agreement. So that's something to keep in mind. Just because you interviewed humans, if you de-identify it, it takes it into a different classification for data sharing. Next slide. Next slide. And HIPAA protected data. There's a number of things you can do with HIPAA. First thing to do is to establish whether or not you're a covered entity. If you work for a hospital and your data is stored at a hospital, if you're at a medical clearinghouse and your data is there, then you have to follow HIPAA. If you're not in a covered entity, then HIPAA is not your problem. HIPAA was designed to cover what's called covered entities. So that's the first thing to establish. Some universities have issued a blanket, we're all HIPAA. That's fine, that's their choice. Most universities have not. Establish whether you're part of a covered entity or not, because if you're not part of a covered entity, HIPAA does not apply to you. If you are part of a covered entity, then be careful. HIPAA has teeth. There are significant fines and significant punishments for violating HIPAA if you are part of a covered entity. There are a number of things you can use. You can use a limited use agreement where you eliminate a set of variables established as being HIPAA compliant from your data set, and then you can share it under that process. One of the problems with that for aging research is there is an aging cap, and death does not help. Dead people have the same HIPAA protection as live people, if you are in a covered entity. But there are tools you can use, and there are ways to avoid HIPAA consequences. If you are part of a covered entity, obey HIPAA, follow HIPAA rules. It's very important because HIPAA actually has significant fines if you violate their guidance. Next slide. Okay, CMS data. CMS data is also special. If you get access to CMS data, it will be through a rather complicated licensing agreement. It's well worth the investment. CMS data is invaluable to aging research, but it cannot be shared. It goes to you. It does not go any further. If someone else wants to work on an idea that you came up with, they will have to go through their own process. CMS data is exclusive to the people included in the license. And right now, if you have an NIA-funded project, there is assistance through NIA to help you get CMS that has become increasingly valuable to researchers. So if you have questions about that, again, send me a message and I will connect you with the information. You can share results from CMS analysis, but you can't share the data. Next slide. Okay, I will turn this over to Becky. One last observation. It's an important one. From now on, your data management sharing plan for future applications. Currently, you're fine, you're grandfathered, but if you're writing a new application or you're going to work on other things in the future, program officers will evaluate your data management and sharing plan. It's no longer study section's responsibility to approve or disapprove the sharing plan. So you and your program officer can discuss and work out the details of the data sharing and management plan if you get funded. All right, Becky.
Thanks, Jim. So we're just going to quickly walk through the 6 NIH specified elements that should be included in the new NIH data management and sharing plans. And these elements they should reflect the proposed approach to data management and sharing at the time the plan is prepared. And it should be updated during the course of the award or the support period to reflect any changes in the management and sharing of data that might occur through new aims or a new scientific direction, changing repositories, or changing your timeline. Before we get into each of them, I want to point your attention to several resources on this page. The first link near the top is the supplemental policy information that describes each of these elements. And the second two towards the bottom are links to various GMS sample plans that might serve as helpful examples. So there are some NIH-specific sample plans from various IC or institutions, and they cover a lot of different scenarios. And then we've also developed a few behavioral and social research specific plans. And we'll make these slides available to the webinar organizers, and hopefully they can be shared to the attendees. So the first element, data description or data type, should briefly describe the scientific data to be managed, preserved, and shared. And here you'll want to summarize the types and the amount of data to be generated during the research. For example, are you collecting survey data, accelerometer data, blood-based biomarkers, and so on. Or in the case of research that exclusively uses secondary data, as Jim mentioned previously, and does not generate any new data, you'll want to indicate that the project is not generating new data and give a quick description of what those secondary data are. Where did they come from? Are they publicly available through some survey? Then you'll describe which scientific data from the project will be preserved and shared. So researchers should decide which data to preserve and share based on ethical, legal, and technical factors, and you'll provide the rationale for those decisions. Again, for a project using secondary data, you shouldn't reshare data that are already available. You'll just indicate that they're already available somewhere. Finally, you'll want to briefly list any metadata or associated documentation that will be shared to facilitate the interpretation of data. For element 2, researchers should provide an indication of whether specialized tools are needed to access or manipulate shared data in order to support replication or reuse. Specifically, you should include how any of those needed tools can be accessed. Is the tool open source and freely available? Is it generally available for purchase in the marketplace? Or is it only available from the research team? Element 3 refers to data standards. And here you should provide an indication of what standards will be applied to the scientific data and associated metadata. So this can include data formats, data dictionaries, data identifiers, and any other data documentation. Now we're aware that for some fields, there are no commonly agreed upon standards. So in that case, you would want to indicate that no standards exist and describe the documentation that will be shared along with the data. We have a little bit of additional information about these metadata standards. So metadata summarizes basic information about data to make finding and working with particular instances of data easier. And one of the common challenges is that there are so many metadata standards. The table on the right on this slide lists nearly 40 standards that are routinely in use by data curators. But most of these standards don't talk to each other. And that's something that researchers should keep in mind when developing a data management plan. As you go to collect data, you really want to make sure that it's interoperable, that other people can use your data and do some homework on what standards might work best for those situations. The next element is about data preservation and access. So here you'll provide the name of your repository where data and metadata from the project will be archived and how those data will be findable and identifiable. So you'll want to provide the digital object identifier, the DOI, or any other standard indexing tools. Finally, researchers will need to provide a timeline of when data will be available. And we wanted to note that NIH guidance specifies that data should be made available no later than the time of publication or the end of the project period, whichever comes first. NIH expects that in drafting these CMS plans, researchers will maximize the appropriate sharing of scientific data consistent with privacy, security, and informed consent issues. So here, you should describe any factors that may affect access to data, such as informed consent limitations or privacy and confidentiality protections that are consistent with federal, tribal, state, and local laws and regulations. Researchers should also describe whether access to data will be controlled or made available after some sort of approval process, and how data privacy rights will be protected, such as through de-identifying human subject data. Finally, researchers should indicate how compliance with the plan will be monitored and managed, the frequency of oversight, and the person who will be responsible for this oversight. Typically, that will be the principal investigator on the project, and the frequency of oversight, in many of the examples that you'll see in the links that we provided, it's annually upon the progress report that you submit to NIH. Now, I wanted to end by noting again that NIH has many, many resources to help investigators understand and comply with the new policy. And we've provided links in several places throughout the slides, which again, we will share with the webinar organizers, and we hope that they'll be shared with attendees. And so we've compiled a few of those links here, but please, take a look throughout the slides. We've provided a lot of various resources that may help to answer some of the questions that are commonly asked about this new policy. So I think that we left plenty of time for questions, and we can get to some of those. And we also just wanted to note again that you can feel free to send any additional questions that you may have to Dr. McNally, and his email address is listed here.
Thank you so much, both. We can open the floor for questions. I know some questions came through in the chat, and would you like to discuss any of those, James or Rebecca?
Sure. There was a question about pre-publication embargoes, and respect that. NIH has no desire to destroy your publication. So if you have to withhold your findings, your data, your code until the publication, follow the journal rules. We want this data to be published. We want this information to be available. There's a number of code libraries out there as well. ICPSR has something called linkage libraries where you can deposit code. NACDA will accept your code if it pertains to a data set we support. There's GitHub and a variety of other code repositories out there. So that is available. There was also an issue about CMS, which I'd be fascinated. I don't know for certain, but I can see no reason why you couldn't share your development code from CMS data, because it requires someone to get the data in order to use the code. And it would be fascinating to see how researchers are developing code. I mean, this is the thing. We all have idiosyncratic ways of recoding and arranging data. And this is one of the reasons why we have so much trouble replicating and reproducing other people's research. How I handle a missing data variable may be very different from the way someone else does. And if we don't use exactly the same mechanism, then we won't get comparable results. There's also an issue about cost. Basically, it's what can you afford? Your budget, there's no additional budget for preparing your data for sharing. So you have to build it into your project budget. So you want to reach out to, if you're going to work with like ICPSR or NACDA, reach out to the program managers. There are established costs. If you're going to work with other groups, find out how much it costs. If you're going to do it yourself, you can talk to an organization like NACDA. NACDA is funded by NIH to support research. So whether a data set comes to NACDA or not is not the primary concern. It's funded to support your research. So if you have questions about how to properly put a data set together for sharing, that's something that NACDA would be happy to talk to you about.
Go ahead. Sorry, I was just going to jump in really quick to say that there is a supplemental notice that's attached to the larger final NIH data sharing policy that does outline allowable and unallowed costs for data management and sharing, and we will be sure to share those links as well.
Thank you. There are some other questions in the chat on written examples. I think, Rebecca, you might have shared or mentioned the link.
Sorry, I was just reading that question. Yes, there are many sample plans that are being posted both on the NIH website. There are some that have been posted recently on the website for the Behavioral and Social Research Division at NIA. And I know that NIA broadly is working on developing more plans to post on the NIA guidelines. So there are many resources that you can use as example plans, example formatting to help you in developing these plans.
Yep. There's also a question about qualitative data. And I think the point needs to be made that all data can be shared. It just depends on the mechanism. So with qualitative data, when you develop your data management plan, offer a rationale how you would provide access to this data to a responsible researcher. It might require them to reach out to you as a one-on-one kind of research contract. There's always a way to share the data. We don't expect, particularly for highly disclosive information, to be just put out on the internet where anybody can download it. If you have specific questions, you can talk to a program officer about what would and would not be. I'm also seeing a couple of questions come out about CBPR issues. And Rebecca, could we show that slide where we had the list of supplements? Supplemental information. Yeah, anybody who's doing CBPR work, I would suggest you read the supplemental information on responsible management of sharing of AIAN participants. While it focuses on tribal authority and their sovereignty issues, it also is a good guidance document for anybody who's doing community-based participatory research. Obviously, trust issues are huge, and working out a way to address the trust issues. Your primary responsibility in CBPR is to the community, the stakeholders. So what you can and cannot share will have to be negotiated with them. If they refuse to share the data, well, there are established cases where this has impacted the data sharing agreement in the past. I would suggest that you bring it up to your program officer and see how they feel about it. But in the end, any data can be shared. It's just how you go about sharing. Do you introduce someone who wants to work with your data to the community and they have to get the trust of that community themselves? There's a lot of scenarios. This is a new policy, and I'm really interested in these kinds of difficult situations. I love these kinds of questions because if I don't have the answer, then we can start to track it down. And the CBPR issues are huge because there is so much effort that goes into developing community trust. And there's a lot of very identifiable information because you are working at the community level. So specific questions can be addressed to a program officer, or you can send them to me directly at the NIA address, because that's part of what I'm doing with NIA, is trying to figure out sensible guidelines. Everybody who works within the RCMAR community know that you're dealing with underserved, understudied, and quite often endangered populations. And we don't want to do anything to hurt your research.
Thank you. I don't see hands or questions in the chat, but maybe I can pose a question to you, perhaps a review or further information on the process of approvals for exceptions. You mentioned at the beginning there could be exceptions, but I'm hoping you can go a little bit more into how do you make those decisions? Who makes the decision about when an exception can be granted? What is that process like?
Well, basically, there's two things. The first thing I would suggest people doing, and we can get the links for you, but NIH and NIA have had a series of webinars discussing the rules and applications that are much more legalistic than I come at it as a researcher. And they offer a much broader perspective of what exceptions apply. So that would be something we could share with you, and you could share with the RCMAR community. Watch those webinars and let the people who helped develop the policy and have been thinking about this for a couple of years. There is quite a bit of latitude, particularly where there's risk of disclosure or confidentiality issues. So don't get concerned. If you're doing a national level study, that's one issue. But if you're working with a small community in, Appalachia or something, that's a separate issue entirely. Data can be shared, but it may have to be restricted to an enclave. It may have to be restricted to one-on-one data use contracts. There's a lot of ways this can be addressed without just putting it out again on the web. If we don't want to risk our respondents, we don't want to risk your credibility as researchers, but we do want to allow people a chance to analyze and use federally funded data for secondary research.
So just to clarify, so at the time that you're thinking about an R01 or a new study, you talk to the program officer, describe the data, figure out
Yeah.
whether or not the program officer then can help you figure out whether or not this should be shared or not be shared. And then you write the policy description explaining why you're not sharing or are sharing and how you're sharing.
And you can draft out, essentially the policy is supposed to be no more than 2 pages. I've seen very long ones that have unnecessary detail, but you can draft out the policy addressing the 6 elements, and you can send it to me if you're applying for something at BSR. I can't speak to the clinical or the intramurals, but if you're writing a grant for NIA BSR, I'd be happy to look at a draft document if you send it to me directly and see if it makes sense.
Thank you.
No.
Tor, would you like to speak about your question? Might be faster.
Sure, thank you. This is really interesting, and I appreciate your time and engagement in these challenging issues. I'm just curious if I work with groups that work with very stigmatized or sensitive populations, sexual and gender minorities, racial and ethnic minorities, and I'm just wondering if anybody is using an approach where they offer in their consent documentation or their consent process participants the ability to opt out of having their individual data shared. I could see where that would be a problem from replicability, because if say like 10% of your participants opt out and you're using the full data set to do your analysis and publish your results, then obviously somebody can't replicate it with say 9/10 of the data, but not all 10/10 of the data. But it would give participants more control to be able to, really maximize their privacy. So is anybody doing anything like that, or?
Well, lots of people are doing it. It's part of the problem.
Okay.
From a consent perspective, there's a lot of debate, and it's a Mac Microsoft kind of problem. My interpretation of consent is that we're promising to protect the identity of the respondent, not their responses. If we put the ability to opt out of sharing their data, then you've introduced bias into your data set. And if you share it, you're knowingly sharing a damaged and biased data set. So that raises a number of ethical questions. On balance, you can offer additional protections in a consent, well, not in the consent document, but in the way you share the data. I mean, you can require people to go through an IRB review of their proposed use of your data. You can require that they have a data security plan where they explain how they will protect the information. You can definitely remove any personal identifiers from the data set, and you can, top code or use disclosive methods to make the data a little less identifiable. Ultimately, this all comes down to how we're training our students. Are we training them to be ethical, responsible researchers? And if we are, then we don't have to worry about them trying to identify someone. The tea room trade is long since past, and there are still people out there who will do harm, but I've found them to be a tiny minority of the research community. So if we train our students to behave ethically, then they will do research ethically. But your responsibility as an investigator, someone who's promising to protect your respondents, well, you take whatever steps you think are necessary and appropriate, because ultimately this is your data. You're investing your blood, sweat, and tears into it, and you're making promises to people that you have to be able to keep. So you can design a data sharing plan that may seem quite restrictive, but if you can justify it, then it's going to pass muster. I mean, there are reasons, stigma, consequences, employment. There are reasons why we restrict data. And it may be that you need special restrictions on your data. I'd be happy to talk with you about any specific concerns you might have, or you could talk to your program officer if you're, planning to submit a grant under the new guidelines.
Great, thank you. This is so helpful. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, we don't want to hurt anybody's research. We don't want to hurt any respondent. We just want to increase the willingness to share, because it's particularly for understudied communities and underserved communities. One of the reasons they're understudied and underserved is because we don't know their problems, and we can't make good policy decisions and arguments because the information isn't out there. So anything we can do to spread knowledge and information, I see that as a win, but we do want to protect your research at all costs.
Thank you so much. One more question in the chat about a long-term cohort study that has original consent is obtained many years ago, and how do you deal with that kind of data where you're not going back to receive consent? I assume that's what, Virginia, am I representing what you're saying?
Yes, that's just a comment. We're continuing to have conversations because we do a lot of data sharing anyway, just on our own. But it does mean we have to kind of keep having this conversation when people write new grants that are using that data. So
Right.
It's just kind of an ongoing conversations.
Well, as the primary investigator of a study, either you reconsent your respondents, which, that's a huge expense, or there are, in the review process, there are risks to the continuation of a project. So these are factors to take into account. If you're sharing the data, that's what you want to emphasize in, your continuing reports and things, who's getting access to the data. It's a discussion worth having. We do have a number of studies, long-term studies, that have been going on for decades that have this issue where the consent, we'll only share this data with our research team, which was fine then, but very problematic in light of the new requirements. This is brand new. Lots of leeway for discussion, lots of opportunities to find solutions to these kinds of problems. So don't be worried, don't be discouraged. We want to work with you. We want to keep this data process going. We want to keep research going.
Thank you. I did, thinking about the circumstances where these kinds of doing the identification could be quite lengthy and time-consuming and resource-intensive. Wonder if you could say a little bit around that. It's not necessarily research per se, so you're not allocating dollars from the funding source, for that back end process. Was wondering if you had anything to say about those situations.
Well, it's going to have to be built into budgets from this point on. Researchers are just going to think about how they can share data. And, big studies, they already have mechanisms in place. There are software out there that can help you de-identify or identify problems in a data set. There's a number of tools you can use. But yeah, you have to plan ahead. I mean, one of the things that I'm not entirely thrilled about is the timeline. The fact that the data has to be deposited and available as of the end of the study. That's going to be a challenge for a lot of people, but that's the way they wrote the guidelines, and that's the guidelines that have to be enforced by NIH. So plan ahead, think about these issues, and reach out to organizations like NACDA for guidance on how to plan. Data sharing should be built into sort of day one when you get your funding notice, and you go from there. So it's built into the process.
Great, thank you. I haven't seen new questions popping up. I see comments. Thank yous to both of you for doing this presentation, spending time with us. Give a pause if there are any other questions. Okay, so I don't see any at the moment. I wanted to thank you so much for taking the time today to talk to us. I also particularly thank you for volunteering to be available for questions from our audience today and anyone else from our community who's going to view this webinar. So I think with that we can close. And once again, thank you.
You're welcome. And again, this is new to us. We're learning. So send me your questions because that helps me think about these issues. This is what NIA has asked me to do, and it's what I do for NACTA. So it ties in nicely with both of my lives. And I just want more data out there. We can learn so much, and particularly from the RCMARs who are working with, the underserved communities. There's just so much information that's inside the RCMARs that would be wonderful to see get more exposure and more promotion, because some of the research these young scholars are doing in the pilots is fascinating. It's really, really fascinating to listen to them. So thank you for everything you guys do as RCMAR participants and RCMAR administrators, because you're doing a great service to the community and representing an important group of the population. So thank you for having us.
Thank you. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks everyone for joining.
Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.